My name is Jeremy Green. I'm a PCI DSS Qualified Security Assessor IT Governance. Interestingly, you can find me listed on the PCI Security Standards Council website under my name and IT Governance. In this webinar, we're going to provide you with a practical introduction about how you go about scoping the cardholder data environment, which we're going to refer to as the CDE, and the webinar also introduces the method of reducing the scope. Please note that everyone will be muted for the duration of the webinar. There'll be an opportunity at the end to address some of your questions, so please enter them in the questions function in the GoToWebinar control panel as we go along. I'll be able to review those. I'll aim to give us around about 15 minutes at the end for those questions, so about 1:45. And for anybody wondering, we'll be emailing everybody a copy of the presentation slides and the webinar recording. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about IT governance. We've been helping clients secure their information and compliance with industry standards since around about 2005. Two of our directors were responsible for the world's first successful implementation of information security management system that conformed to BS 7799, which is the forerunner of ISO 27001. Today, our consultancy practice now helps clients towards protecting and securing their intellectual capital, complying with the relevant regulations, and continuing to allow business to thrive as they achieve strategic goals through better IT management. We're also a leading provider of PCI DSS training courses from foundation to advanced level, as well as e-learning courses. And that's part of what I also do, is train people on a kind of face-to-face basis. As an authorized QSA company, IT governance has been certified by the PCI Security Standards Council to audit merchants for PCI DSS compliance, which means that our consultants follow a recognized approach for securing cardholder data and under the PCI DSS keeping their skills relevant and current. So IT governance gets audited by the Security Standards Council to ensure that we're providing a quality approach. So today's discussion, we're going to be looking at meeting the requirements of the standard, which any standard will absorb the company's energies and resources. Reducing this cost while seeing the benefits of compliance should be a primary goal for everyone. And the key to achieving this is to define up front which areas the organization the rules will apply to. So scoping is especially beneficial when implementing a complex standard like the PCI DSS card industry data security standard, which we all know is the PCI DSS, with 355 requirements and sub-requirements, many of which are highly technical. Defining a scope which is too narrow can lead to the cardholder data being compromised as things get ignored or missed, while scope which is too broad can significantly increase the costs, which is why PCI Security Standards Council strongly recommend reducing the scope to acceptable minimum. But it's often difficult for organizations to determine what is meant by scope, and where the environment is complex, how to determine a suitable approach to determine that scope. Ultimately, there is often a realization that the scope will need to be reduced in order to achieve compliance. The consequences resulting from failure and non-compliance can be severe, ranging from the crippling costs of forensic investigation to the loss of the ability to accept card payments, from fines to the loss of customer confidence. Fortunately, there are guidelines and products available that can help organizations of any size reduce the cardholder data environment while maintaining security. This results in an implementation which is quicker, smoother, and ultimately better. Generally, the consultants that come in and help you with this, their job generally is to help you reduce that scope. So the question is, why do we need a CDE diagram? what we can see from the slide is there are very specific requirements that deal with the cardholder data environment and how to diagram it. It's worth noting that organizers required to be formally assessed their compliance must have network diagrams and data flow diagrams. For self-assessing entities, a network diagram is mandatory for a number of the SAQs. So SAQA for e-commerce portal, SAQB for pen entry devices which are IP connected, and SAQD, which is generally all the entirety of the standard. While SAQA and AEP D also require card data flow diagrams. For the remaining questionnaires, these diagrams are not mandatory, but it's a good practice to create one or more diagrams to illustrate the CDE. The networks and systems that are part or connected to the CDE and the journey of cardholder data and sensitive authentication data across systems network as it is captured, transmitted, processed, and potentially stored. And without diagrams, account data may be overlooked, often unprotected, exposed to fraud, or stored in breach of the PCI DSS. For self-assessment, there is a requirement to confirm that the environment has been correctly scoped, and without network diagrams and data flow diagrams, this will be difficult to demonstrate. For level 1 organizations, which are generally the 6 million Visa transactions, 2.5 million Amex transactions, those organizations are required to complete an annual audit, and in the executive summary and details about the reviewed environment sections at the front part of the report on compliance, I as a QSA are required to be provided with those diagrams, generate and create those diagrams. So I need to see a high-level network diagram, a CDE, external and internal network connectivity diagram, and a card transaction data flow diagram. And the purpose of those diagrams is to give people such as those of your acquiring bank and the card brands or the forensic examiners in the event of a breach, an overview of your organization's network and how card data flows over that network, so they have some context when they're looking at the report on compliance. So what is scoping? For the purpose of implementing the PCI DSS, scoping is the process of identifying the system components, people and processes to be included in the assessment. It is the first task that everybody should undertake when seeking to become compliant. It's necessary under certain SAQs, and if you've got an external assessment, but it's also advisable. So the target of scoping is to identify which aspects are part of the cardholder data environment, or which parts could affect the security. According to the standard, this comprises of the people, the processes and technology that store, process, or transmit cardholder or sensitive authentication data. And remember, it includes the connected systems. So when we look at how you approach it through this step-by-step approach, step 1 is you're going to identify where the organization receives cardholder data. You're then going to locate it at rest, where it's transmitted, and then you're going to be able to identify those systems that store, process, or the people that are used to handle that cardholder data. And with this growing picture, you'll have more and more systems that come into scope, and you'll be able to make a decision. And then you're going to implement controls to minimize scope so that only the necessary components, such as the people or process, are included. And then you can implement the PCI against that known scope. And then ongoing, you're going to maintain and monitor that view of your entire environment, the scope, and the cardholder data environment. So what is cardholder data? What is sensitive authentication data? The slide gives us an overview of two differing pieces of information. Cardholder data is the primary account number, the cardholder's name, the service code, and the expiry And what it indicates is some of this is stored and some of this can be viewed, but with the primary account number, you've got to store it in an encrypted format. Then we come on to sensitive authentication data, and that is all of the data that is used for the approval, the settlement, and the clearing of data. And they're generally the pieces of information that appear on the back of the card, such as the CVV2, the full direct track data for the swipe, and the PIN information in your head when you're using the card. And we've got to identify where we've got cardholder data stored. We cannot store sensitive authentication data, so immediately if we find that information being stored anywhere, then we know that we've got to do some work in reducing the scope and eliminating that form of information. Unless you know what kind of information you're working with, you can't really undertake the next step, which is to map out where the data flow begins and ends within the environment. So the most important piece next is to create a data flow map. And it's important to determine where the stream of information enters your organization, how it's handled internally, and potentially where it does leave the organization. You may be a payment processor, or you may be a merchant collecting information in such a way that you are using it and it will leave the organization off to a payment processor. So these are questions you need to now answer. And during this process, you need to create an accurate data flow diagram that lays out the results in a clear and understandable way, because you're going to have to communicate this across various parts of the business so that everybody understands. And diagrams are very useful for that. And it doesn't take a huge amount of technical skill to understand and discuss with people where cardholder data moves. So the mapping of data flow requires you to find files on a company network, also search in databases, any messaging service such as email, chat, and any removable media where you may be moving cardholder data around. There are automated tools that can do cardholder data discovery, and that will speed up the process. And they're either freeware or you can use them on a subscription basis. Of course, you're all going through that kind of GDPR data protection aspect of data discovery, so you can use the same sort of tools to automate it and look at cardholder data in the same way. And it's very specific, and we now know what cardholder data is. It's the primary account number and the expiry date and the name. So we're going to be looking for very specific pieces of information. And if we find any sensitive authentication data using the tools, we can obviously eliminate those. The next bit really is to as a merchant, is to identify any payment channels. And payment channels are your e-commerce route. It may be mail order. It may be face-to-face. And generally, they can be separated out when you're doing your data discovery, because they often are very individual or unique views on how cardholder data is processed, and they generally don't overlap. So it's often makes sense to look at it from that perspective. And what we find is even very large organizations often make mistakes at this stage, where they're not looking at the end-to-end processes and running through each payment channel and looking at where cardholder works and how it moves through. And this could result in you having multiple diagrams for the retail locations. You may have multiple diagrams for the e-commerce, the contact center. You may have diagrams involving the finance departments where they're perhaps dealing with chargebacks or other information. And they will all need documenting. And it's not a technical document, it's about how cardholder data is processed through your environment. There may be other card data flow diagrams that show how the manual or paper-based process relate to the cardholder data. They will also need documenting. And this is often where I find that businesses aren't documenting. They forget about the people and how pieces of paper move and how people have to handle that cardholder data and who has to see it. So there's a tendency to concentrate on the technology. And while we forget the two other key elements in the PCI DSS is definition of scoping, because people and process must be considered alongside the technology. And that's the process of mapping the data flow. For example, it may include phone operators taking cardholder data over the telephone. It may involve a post room where forms, receipts, and other information come through. A till receipt is cardholder data if it contains the full primary account number. And don't forget, it's going to be really important to interview and have discussions with the various people doing those roles, because they're a valuable resource and they'll help you with the discovery of where cardholder data is flowing and moving around. You can create the data flows and maps in whatever format you want, but you've got to make it pertinent to your own business, and everybody's got to be able to understand them. Ultimately, if you're filling this out and you end up having to do an external assessor coming in, then you're going to be presenting that external assessor with the information that you've gathered. So there's some key concepts within PCI DSS, but we're going to have to establish a perimeter of what is cardholder data, which is CDE systems, which systems are connected, and which systems are out of scope. So what you can do is you can take your data flow diagrams, compare it to an up-to-date network diagram where relevant. Obviously, if it's a people process, then that doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but you're gonna be able to follow that through and map it. And you're gonna map it onto either the physical process, and if you're dealing with e-commerce or systems that are handling cardholder data, you're going to be talking to your ID departments because they're best placed to help you create the diagrams. And it should map out the entire IT infrastructure and any external connections. We're often very good at the physical aspect of where cardholder data is flowing. We understand that. But when it comes to data in files, formats, protocols, messaging, we often lose sight of that and don't understand how the data flow works. So without a current network diagram, you can have systems overlooked. They could be unknowingly left out of the security controls that you need to implement for PCI DSS, or you might find that those network connections could be left poorly protected. What I find is an up-to-date IT asset register will help you determine if all systems have been reviewed part of the process. So it's often sensible to flag which systems are in scope in terms of what you think are within the cardholder data environment. But rather than leaving out the components you think are out of scope, the best approach is to concentrate first accurately representing the components and their connections, comparing to the data flow diagram, and then this will help you establish which technologies impact CDE. Remember, system components could be included in the assessment on network components. There are the servers, there are the applications that are part of connected to the CDE. They include systems that provide security services, such as authentication servers, name servers, directory servers, or anything that actually facilitates or helps provide that protection. So you may find that it will definitely include firewalls. You may have layer 3 switches in that provide access control lists or other methods of integrating and linking systems together. So anything that may impact the security, such as web redirection service, also need to be included. It also covers virtualized components. So it involves the virtualized host and then obviously any virtualized clients that live within it. The virtualization could include virtualized switches, routers, the hypervisor, and even virtualized network components. So the PCI DSS standard does not exclude any of those. It treats those the same as physical components. So each component within the scope must be assessed for the risk it poses to the cardholder data environment. As an organization, must also determine whether the appropriate controls are in place to mitigate that risk. This is no small task, so it's natural that organizations want to ensure that as many possible systems are out of scope. It's also necessary to find indirect systems, the people and processes and technologies that support effect of those systems, including any third-party controls or third-party organization. So if you've outsourced your IT department to a third party, they're going to impact or potentially impact the cardholder data environment. They become in scope because they're providing a security service for you. They manage your firewalls, therefore they are the people and the process that could affect security. So after you've identified the direct and indirect technology and process and people that come into contact with that data, you can therefore define the security perimeter. And you're going to end up with three groups: systems in the CDE, which store, process, or transmit cardholder data; systems that are connected to or touch that environment, whilst they don't necessarily have cardholder data moving through them, or they could impact them. If any of those systems are compromised, then they could compromise the CDE, or if they're a firewall, they will provide that level of protection at the perimeter. And then you've got hopefully a large amount of systems that are out of scope that wouldn't interact with the environment. So the next phase really is you've now got a very large scope. What you now need to do is attempt to minimize that. So the steps so far, you've got which components have access to the CDE. Unfortunately, the next step is more difficult. You need to examine each of those components and ask yourself, does it actually need access to the cardholder data environment? While many organizations make mistakes at this point, it's also the point of gauging opportunity. And if you can make some very strategic or smart decisions at this stage about reducing the scope, then you can reduce the problem of PCI DSS compliance very considerably. It'll simplify the implementation process, and ultimately, which is what PCI DSS is designed to do, is increase the security. Although not technically necessary to become PCI DSS compliant, it's highly recommend that you do go through a scope reduction exercise. So you need to restrict access only what is needed to carry out the business task. This is a good way to ensure the scope reduction across the whole of the PCI DSS. One method of ensuring the minimal level access is to look at the inbound and outbound traffic separately and ensure that, for example, that databases, where they get the information from, do they require outbound channels and inbound channels to move that data around? And it might sound very technical, but it's easy to understand when you have your diagram and you refer back and you can map and push through and see where cardholder data is flowing through. And you might find that your databases do not contain cardholder data. They contain client or transactional information, but they don't have any cardholder data in, and therefore they can move out of scope if you've done your exercise correctly. One very common thing is to try and get wireless network access to the CD out of scope, and generally avoid having cardholder data transmitted over wireless networks. It always poses significant risk. And if it's not possible for business reasons, it's a good idea to put in additional firewalls, additional protection, additional segmentation to restrict access to a bare minimum. So the best advice is to avoid storing the PAN. And this is what you can do. If you don't need to store cardholder data, then you don't have things in scope. It's easier to achieve than it might appear. There are several actions you can undertake at this point. First, you can review each indirect system to discover whether it should be involved in handling cardholder data or sensitive authentication data. For example, many businesses believe that they need all the cardholder data and all the sensitive authentication data they collect for their accounting records or to track customer spending. But generally, there are no business need or the circumstance to have the primary account number in all places. You could basically have the last 4 digits and use that as your means of tracking customer interaction. So therefore, if you don't need to store the PAN, then the PCI DSS doesn't apply into areas of that business. And therefore, they're out of scope for the assessment, and this scope can be drastically reduced. Once you have no longer storing the data, you only have to worry about whether it's in transit across your network, which makes network segmentation a lot easier. So the Payment Card Industry Security Standard Council recommends that when it comes to scoping for the PCI DSS, the best practice approach is to start with the assumption that everything is in scope until verified otherwise. In other words, where there is a connectivity across or access to the CD from systems outside the CDA, all applicable PCI DSS requirements should be applied to secure the connections and access. When correctly implemented, network segmentation is one of the recommended that it can help reduce the number of components in scope for PCI DSS. It recommends to help minimize. It reduces the cost and scope of the PCI DSS assessment, the cost and effort of implementing and maintaining PCI DSS controls, and the risk to the organization. So networking segmentation involves applying additional controls to separate systems. And when correctly applied, a segment or out-of-scope system may not impact the security of the CDE. So if a hacker was to gain access to those other systems, then they would never be able to access the CDE. And that's how you can create the security. Segmentation consists of logical controls, physical controls, or a combination of both. For example, commonly used segmentation method providing perhaps having a firewall with VLANing and router configurations to prevent traffic passing between different segments or sections of your internal network. And thus you can prevent communication between different systems and subnets. The alternative is you can have physically separate networks, and that's how you create a form of segmentation. Remember, outsourcing to a cloud hosting provider could be considered to be network segmentation. Your core business doesn't have access to that without going through firewalls and authentication controls. Once you're considering using network segmentation, unfortunately, you're going to have to test that those controls are in place and functioning actively. So requirement 11.3.4 requires that segmentation for merchants is tested annually, and for service providers, you're looking at every 6 months. And remember, if a system is determined to be out of scope, the organization should not leave the system unprotected, as any cyber attack, large or small, is born from a weak link in the security chain. So whilst you're considering out of scope systems, the wider security should be considered. But when you're looking at PCI DSS compliance, you will achieve a narrowly defined scope, and you can take a risk-based view about those additional systems. One of the easiest ways for merchants to reduce the scope of their e-commerce solutions is to use the concept of redirects. This is where the web page redirects to a different service provider, and it provides a very simple, much easier to follow if the merchant processes cardholder data on their own. What redirects do is they cause a new window, for example, an iframe, or a completely new window to be generated on the customer's browser. And after the customer proceeds to the checkout with their cart, the website takes them to a secure payment page that's hosted by a payment service provider to complete the payment. So you can see in this case that the merchant's website is now out of scope because the payment processing by the client to the payment provider is a direct link. There's no cardholder data flowing through the merchant website. The payment provider will verify the validity of the card and provide all of the authorization, settlement, and clearing upon completion. And then you're then redirected as a customer back to the e-commerce site. The only real downside to that is the customer journey may appear to be less seamless, but a lot of the new payment redirect processes or iframes are well constructed, and the customer journey appears to be more seamless as style and look and feel looks good. An e-commerce solution using the redirect approach is out of scope for PCI DSS, and the reason is that redirect could be hijacked is that could be enabling the attacker to redirect traffic to a rogue server. So the merchant is still responsible for protecting processing of the transaction, even though the transaction are not processed by them. So what you'll find is that you've got responsibility for cardholder data, but you're asking a service provider to manage that on your behalf. So you're not out of scope for PCI DSS. You've just taken a way of reducing your scope and getting a third party to tackle that. So the Council does not say that a redirect scenario needs to meet all PCI DSS requirements, only those that are relevant. And generally people are aware of the self-assessment questionnaire A as a means of satisfying a bulk of the requirements that a fully outsourced solution offers. So as a result, the servers doing the redirects need basic security such as firewall security hardening, patching, critical file monitoring, and antivirus, so the redirect is protected. But they're generally, the server is taken out of scope. Another method of reducing scope is to replace the cardholder data with a token. So organization increasingly embracing the security benefits of tokenization, and by using tokenization you can reduce the number of locations where they're retaining cardholder data information by limiting the storage of plain text sensitive data, because the token isn't cardholder data, it's an encrypted format or a completely random token that doesn't represent cardholder data in itself. So the tokenization solution randomly generates a value to replace the credit card data, and consequently, if correctly implemented, the tokenization solution will mean all of the merchant will never has access to see the customer's credit card details. With tokenizations, there's no mathematical relationship between the token and the data value, and therefore there's only a kind of contextual reference to those two pieces of information. And therefore the only way in which credit card values are related to the token is through this third party data vault or a token vault using the third parties or your own systems. So therefore storing tokens in PANs is therefore an effective way of getting the scope reduction, because it doesn't represent cardholder data, and therefore you can take some of those systems out of scope. Since cardholder data isn't available outside the original point of capture and the data vault, the scope is reduced depending on how the company's technology and business process interact with the payment data. If a third party handles the card vault, it's out of scope for the merchant, but remember, you as a merchant are making the service provider or the third party responsible for protection of it. It's also advisable to check that you're not continuing to store the PAN. You may have moved from an in-scope solution and applying tokenization, but then have forgotten to remove all of the legacy PAN data that you may have been storing. So you're going to have to use the same data delivery tools that you started with to ensure that you continue to remove or redact out any legacy data and make checks to see that you're not continuing to store cardholder data moving forward. Another technique is to use point-to-point encrypted solutions. A point-to-point encrypted solution cryptographically protects the cardholder data from the endpoints. A P2P solution is provided by a third-party solution provider, and it's a combination of secure devices, applications, processes that encrypt the data from the point of accepting payment to it reaches the service solution provider's secure decryption environment. And P2P is a Security Standards Council branded name for end-to-end encryption. And by using P2P, card data is made unreadable until it reaches the secure decryption environment, which makes it less valuable if the data is stolen during or while it's transmitting across your environment. So if the merchant doesn't have the ability to decrypt the data, nor any access to the encryption keys, therefore they don't have any access to customers' personal card data, it means they're out of scope for those elements that it's transmitting through. And merchants using P2P listed P2P solutions have fewer applicable PCI DSS security standard requirements, which will help simplify compliance efforts. And if you're properly implementing a P2P validated solution and have no access to unencrypted data, then you potentially can qualify for around about 35 of the requirements questions that you will need to fill in. So, in summary, scoping is the first step on the road to gaining or maintaining PCI DSS compliance. And the effective scope reduction can reduce the time and the cost of becoming compliant. While scope reduction is not required for PCI DSS, it's recommended by all those involved with compliance as one of the best methods of achieving and making the PCI DSS process cost effective. What we've established is that there are many ways of reducing the scope, and each organization will need to assess the best ways of achieving this for their network and payment channels. So whilst we've discussed scope reduction by network logical segmentation, and we've discussed using encryptions and tokenization to remove cardholder data, or using technical solutions like P2PE, they're by no means the entire set of ways of reducing scope. One example would be don't handle any cardholder data and get your third parties to manage those. And there are lots of solution providers from contact centers through to online payment IVRs and the web redirection process, which will help you achieve compliance and enable you to concentrate on selling your products as a merchant. But you need to consider adequate planning and thought about the scope of the PCI DSS, as it can be a big win if you can get the scope reduction down. So it's important to note that there are no solutions or technology that eliminates all PCI DSS requirements. The tools and technologies such as encryption or tokenization may help reduce the risk and may reduce the applicability of some of the PCI DSS requirements and reduce the size of the CDE, but ultimately, if you are responsible for the cardholder data, then you are still need to be PCI DSS compliant. Before we go to the questions and answer section of this presentation, I'd like to raise your awareness the following webinars as part of the series on PCI DSS. So the next webinar takes place on the 1st of August. We'll take a look at the security testing, which forms part of the layered set of security controls. So be aware that we've now got a way of segmenting the network. We've already indicated that we're going to have to prove that that segmentation is effective and that all of the other controls are also effective. So we need to remember that security testing is an important check in the process. So if patching has occurred, if secure system builds are operating effectively, the security testing is part of that layered set of controls where you're checking that everything has been done correctly and you've got a means of validating the risk, the vulnerabilities of that. And then in September, we're going to look at the overarching need for information security framework, and that will set the tone for the organization's approach to securing cardholder data. So with a good tone of a business down, then you should be in a good position to use administrative controls where you're urging people from an acceptable use perspective not to send cardholder data, not to put cardholder data onto USB sticks. And that's what the policy and procedure framework is going to give you, is a good information security tone to protect cardholder data. So I think we're now in a good position to open up questions. So if anybody has any questions, we can pick up those and run through those in detail. So I'm just reviewing a few of the questions. So I've got a SIP UDP question. Is it possible to get SIP UDP recorded as a false positive on vulnerability scans, as this technology is critical to larger voice server side or the business? So the question really is, in my opinion, is shouldn't you be using, for example, secure SIP? So therefore you eliminate, and you can basically say that SIP is out of scope and therefore shouldn't be part of the cardholder data, and therefore neither party can unencrypt it. Next question. What elements should we address in conducting risk assessments for PCI DSS? What I think you should do is, when treating PCI DSS, as I think you should consider that the Security Standards Council have actually done a risk assessment for you. What they've determined is these are the set of controls. So if you take a traditional ISMS and you view it in that kind of way, what we're saying is you don't need to do a risk assessment for PCI DSS. You know what your assets are. It's your cardholder data. The PCI Security Standards Council have determined, based on various scenarios, what the risks to the data is, and they've pre-built a set of controls. You can align those with Annex A, and you could basically say, from a PCI DSS perspective, that has been created, and therefore, from risk assessment, I would run through the entirety of the scope, look at all of the controls you need to apply, and there's a document called the Prioritized Approach Spreadsheet, and for each requirement there is a risk factor, and you can download from the Security Standards Council website this prioritized list, and what it recommends you do milestone 1 elements first, and they are typically remove cardholder data from the environment as a way of reducing scope. Hopefully, Mohammed, that kind of answers your question. Next question is, what is the requirement for tokenization or tokenization length, etc.? There is a minimum requirement that it needs to be sufficiently strong and comply with NIST requirement. So, for example, if you were using AES to encrypt a piece of data, then it needs to be a minimum of 128-bit. And the standard, so if you get held at standard, look for the requirements to do with the storage of cardholder data, which will be in requirement 3 and the group of sub-requirements. Look for NIST, and then it will refer you on. There are some examples of those, and you could just use NIST. It's not, remember, PCI DSS is a basic level of security that needs to apply, and therefore they're assuming that this is a sensible approach, and they'll just align it to NIST. And if NIST up the requirements based on breaches, then you will need to reflect that. The only other challenges with requirements in 3 is if you are going to have a cryptographic environment to do the tokenization, you're going to have to document that in detail, explain how and why the cryptographic processes work, the levels of encryption you use. So you're going to need a cryptographic policy, some cryptographic procedures. You're going to need some key custodians. You need to be aware that your key encryption keys need to be as strong as your data encrypting keys, but there's no specific, the standard will tell you exactly how long the key is, refer to NIST. Been asked a question about, is SMS multi-factor authentication safe nowadays? To be honest, I haven't come across anybody using secure SMS. We know that SMS as a protocol is not sufficient for PCI DSS. I would avoid using SMS for your method of communicating primary account numbers around. I would choose a web portal or a browser contact back if you need to validate that, and not issue it. For example, you can't have a PIN, you can't transmit the CVV2, so therefore I would avoid SIP. And I've come across clients using SIP, and we've recommended that they stop doing that process. And essentially, you provide a link in the SMS to go back to the website, and then the user logs back in and can look at the transactional data if that's what they need to do. Hopefully I've answered everybody's questions. I'll keep waiting, see if any more questions. I can give you some preamble, which is, as a QSA, when I go and do a gap analysis, this scoping exercise is something that takes up a large proportion of the first contact with you as merchants or service providers. We'll probably spend a couple of hours looking at scope and trying to help you. And at that point, it may be sensible for us to not do a gap analysis against the existing organization, but to consider that if you were to implement a number of scope reduction measures immediately, then you could proceed with a reduced scope and do the gap analysis based on that reduced scope. So it's often worth considering that as an approach, that rather than using the gap analysis as a health check on a solution, use your QSAs to help you go in and discuss scope reduction early. And as we've reflected in the presentation, you get that done early, you reduce the scope, you simplify, reduce cost. Maybe consider workshop sessions with the QSA. They can help you with that scope reduction exercise. I think if there's no more questions, then we can potentially terminate the webinar. Hope you found it useful. Yeah, rejoin the next ones looking at testing. I think it's important you do that, and obviously get your documented policies and procedures in place. Okay, more questions. With regard to redirection, is this for the customers, for the customer protect fully? I'm assuming that because the it's just updated it. So the reality is that the redirection, because the customer is being redirected to a visibly secure site, and the payment service provider has put a significant effort in to producing a secure site, then yes, the answer is it's one of the most sensible, easy ways for you as a merchant to take the problem away and push it over to essentially a business that is using and putting that security in place and managing and maintaining it. And what it means is you as a website developer for an e-commerce platform can concentrate on the look and the feel and how your page works, and obviously dealing with customer retention, improving the checkout process, and you don't have to consider that you will have to have some security specialists in to help you with cryptographic technologies for storing cardholder data. And there are obviously lots of hosted payment processors out there that will deal with both tokenization and the full page redirect. I've got another question. Please, can you explain segmentation again, and how does it help improve the security? So the problem with PCI DSS is that, in simple terms, anything that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data must be in the CDE and therefore must be scope. Any systems that can connect to that, so imagine that you had a contact center with somebody taking cardholder payments via a PC, and all of the other PCs in the environment were connected to that PC via the network, they would also be in scope. So therefore, without segmenting that contact center team's systems off from all of the others, you've then got a wider scope. And the wider scope means that you will have to patch, antivirus, have build standards, have monitoring to ensure that there are no vulnerabilities on those, retain logging, have a security and event monitoring solution on all of them. Whereas if you were to get your scope correct, and your scope could be only those PCs are on the same VLAN, and therefore they are the only systems that are in scope that process, store, and transmit cardholder data, which could comprise of 2 or 3 systems rather than an office with 50 systems. And that's what the idea behind scope reduction is it's not necessarily just that you have a number of machines to consider, it's all of the other systems that fit in, and therefore you've got a whole world of pain in terms of getting all of those systems managed, maintained, part of your PCI DSS scope. Next question is, if we follow ISMS risk assessment methodology, can we fulfill requirements 12.1.2? The question then is, as long as you have referenced the security of the cardholder data environment and included that in your risk, the simple ones I normally do is just have 1 or 2 lines within your overall business risk assessment that say maintain the risk of maintaining PCI DSS compliance, high, medium, low, likely, unlikely, and do a risk assessment on that. There will be obviously a cost of you not being PCI DSS compliant. There will be a risk involved in a breach if you're not PCI DSS compliant. Why not treat it as a 1 or 2 line entry within your overall risk assessment that you can do that? Have I answered everybody's questions on segmentation? Remember, segmentation isn't necessarily just the network segmentation, it could be data segmentation. So you can see that if you can't access the data as it flows across your network from endpoint to endpoint, clearly nothing inside your business is in scope because it cannot unpack, modify, affect the security of the cardholder data, which is how the point-to-point encryption devices work. They generally work at a store level where you and I are the customer and we're using a pin entry device, which is essentially P2P compliant. The store cannot affect the security of the cardholder data flowing across that encrypted link, and therefore the entirety of the store is almost out of scope from a network perspective, and the only process and procedures that they would need to observe would be the physical security of the device, and there may be some physical access controls to areas of the environment. But there would be no need potentially to consider testing of the environment. There would be no firewalls inspections. There'd be very little technology left. And as I said, there's around about 35 controls left, which are mainly to do with physical security of those devices. So, as we said, in summary, divide your scope into those three areas: systems in the CDE, systems that could touch or affect the security of the CDE, and those systems that don't or couldn't touch or get to either of those groups of systems. The problem it means is that you end up with a compartmentalized business where you're securing data in a reduced number of systems, and you're focusing on those, and that's the entirety of it. If you go down the other option, which is to not segment, then you just end up with more systems, and they're often very difficult to manage and maintain PCI DSS compliant over a vast number of systems. Keep them patched, keep them up to date, keep them secure. The mere problems of just keeping the vulnerability management process, the security event monitoring process is running on considerably larger systems will just be costly and time consuming. So we've got, in my opinion, 3 or 4 minutes to go. More than happy to continue answering questions.